Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started now that we've hit the 4 o'clock hour. My name is Melissa Burdor, and I work with the National Office of the National Ocean Sciences Bowl, and I want to thank you for joining us for our webinar this afternoon. We hold this professional development webinar series for coaches each year, and it's obviously to provide information to coaches on topics that they might not know, as this is related to our theme for the year. This is also a way to help you prepare your students for competitions, and if you happen to be a non-NOSB educator, we hope that you'll also enjoy the webinar today. As I mentioned, we have a yearly theme, and these webinars are often held in conjunction with that theme, and so for this year, it's our Changing Oceans, Science for Strong Coastal Communities. Basically, this means all of our theme topics are related to the idea of coastal resilience. So today, we're going to have our last webinar of the series, and just so you know, if you haven't done this before with us, the webinar is going to last about an hour for the presentation, and then we'll have 30 minutes for question and answers at the end. So you can see that there is a chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. That's where you're going to type in all your questions. We have all of you muted right now so that we don't have the presenters interrupted by dogs barking and cell phones ringing and all that. So feel free to type in your questions at any point during the webinar, but we will save them for the end. And I'll read through them. I'll read them aloud for the presenters to answer those. Also, feel free to provide feedback on what you enjoyed with this series or this webinar, either in the Q&A box or at our email, which is nosb@oceanleadership.org. A lot of times your comments help us retain funding for the series and for the NOSB program, so we'd love to hear back from you. So this afternoon, I'm really happy to announce that we have two presenters for today's webinar. We have Ethan Theuerkauf and Justin Ridge, and they are both PhD candidates at UNC's Institute of Marine Sciences. The IMS is actually going to be our host for the finals competition in April this year, and you've probably seen from our webinar series that we've been highlighting a lot of their researchers, and I'm really happy today that we can highlight some PhD students. So just so you know, we will be recording this webinar, and we'll have it up on our YouTube station tomorrow. So if you need to log out early for any reason, don't worry, you won't miss anything. So I'm now going to turn this over to Ethan and Justin, and they can start their presentation.
All right, well, thank you very much. We are really excited to be here. This is Ethan talking right now, and I actually am an NOSB alumni. I participated when I was in high school in the Blue Crab Bowl, which is the Virginia NOSB Bowl. So I'm really excited to be talking to you all today.
And I'm Justin. I am actually from Indiana, so I have a rural place in Indiana. I have no prior experience with NOSB, but also excited to be here today. Our talk, Our Changing Coast, is going to be about some of the work we've been doing here in North Carolina, and we're going to be looking at some of the ways that our estuarine shorelines have been changing with sea level rise and other climatic changes.
So before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge our co-authors who have helped us with this work. Our advisor, Dr. Antonio B. Rodriguez, here at UNC as well. Dr. Joel Faudry, who co-advises Justin, and then Drew Stevens and Caroline White Knockleby, who are both undergraduate students that worked on this project with us. So the outline for our talk today, I'm going to go through some basics of salt marsh carbon storage. So we're really going to be focusing on the salt marsh portion of estuaries and discussing carbon that's being buried in these marshes, some potential losses of that carbon that's being buried, and then ways that we can protect that. And so I'm going to present basically, the idea behind salt marsh carbon storage. I'll talk about the model that we've put together of a marsh carbon budget. And this is really important to assess because we basically need to understand how carbon's functioning in these salt marsh environments if we're going to use them to maybe offset fossil fuel emissions, and I'll go through that in a little bit. We'll go to Carrot Island, North Carolina, and actually apply this model and look at a carbon budget there. And then explore the future of that sink and how reducing shoreline erosion might actually help to sustain carbon burial in these environments.
And this will lead right into my work looking at oyster reef growth in general, and this is going to kind of build off of, if you guys saw Carolyn Curran's presentation, her living shoreline stuff, I looked at how these marsh reef complexes have evolved over the last century and a half.
All right, so let's get right into it. Salt marshes are very important ecosystems for a number of reasons. They provide a lot of what we call ecosystem services. So they're animal habitat, they are nursery habitat and foraging habitat for adult and juvenile species. They provide storm surge protection. So that marsh grass is very good at attenuating wave energy. So if you have a storm coming through, they basically act as a buffer to the mainland. They are sites where pollutants are actually being filtered, so they're protecting our waterways. And then the ecosystem service that we're going to be focusing on today, which is carbon sequestration. So these environments are actually burying a lot of carbon. Now, salt marshes are part of a suite of habitats known as blue carbon habitats. And really what that is are just coastal vegetated habitats. And you can see here on this figure, on the x-axis, we're looking at different environments, and then on the y, their associated carbon burial rate. And so on the left here, tropical forest, boreal, temperate forest, these are all your terrestrial environments. And then on the right, you see salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And so you can see that the carbon burial rates for these blue carbon environments are an order of magnitude higher. And so that gives you an indication right off the bat of how important these environments might be in terms of carbon sequestration, actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, blue carbon has gained a lot of popularity recently because of that opportunity to basically offset carbon emissions from fossil fuel combustion. And so the idea of using, the area of these habitats as a way of getting a credit and actually being able to offset, pollution. So the idea behind salt marsh carbon storage is illustrated by this figure that I'm going to go through for a couple of minutes here. And salt marshes are inherently tied to sea level. So as sea level rises, marshes grow vertically to basically keep pace with sea level. They're intertidal environments, and so they need to grow with sea level. And so as they grow with sea level, they're actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, they're fixing it, and then they're storing it in the sediments below the marsh. So as sea level rises, that marsh sediment package actually increases through time. So that's one way that that marsh carbon increases through time. The other way is, like I mentioned earlier, marshes are really good at buffering wave energy, and that grass is also really good at trapping sediments. So they can actually basically act as a sponge in trapping in the sediments that may be floating around in the water column. That's another way that the marsh can grow vertically. And so what you have is this package of sediment that's growing upward through time, and along with that, carbon is actually increasing through time. So a lot of what the scientific community is focused on in terms of salt marsh carbon storage has really been on this burial term and looking at different processes that are happening in terms of carbon burial through time. Now, this area, salt marshes, they're actually a landscape. And so they're not only growing vertically, but their boundaries are changing. So not only we might have shoreline erosion on the estuarine side, so the side closest to the water, but then we also might have what's known as transgression or landward migration of the marsh up into the mainland as sea level rises. And so it's not a static environment, it's changing through time. And so if you're coming up with a carbon budget, you really have to include that in the budget as well. And that's really what I'm going to be focusing in on today, is actually including in that portion of the budget that pertains to erosion. Now, thinking about marsh loss and marsh erosion is a really important factor because we're losing marshes globally. So this figure on the top here is showing you in orange all the areas that we've had marsh loss since the 1940s. So you can see it's ubiquitous across the world. And actually, we've lost about 25% of our global habitat since the 1940s, and we have a loss rate of about 2% per year. And there are a lot of culprits at play here that are serving to lose or to reduce the amount of marsh area. Sea level rise is actually one of them. So not only are marshes tied to sea level, but they can actually drown if sea level rises too rapidly or they can't keep pace with sea level. Now, anthropogenic disturbance, so if humans are building upland of the marsh and that marsh can't migrate landward during sea level rise, but yet the shoreline's eroding, that marsh will narrow through time and we end up with marsh loss. And then also shoreline erosion, and that's what's showing in this figure here. You can see the blue line is the shoreline in 1958, and then in 2012, the shoreline is quite a bit landward, and that marsh is being lost, and the marsh is narrow. So when we look at a salt marsh and we think about what the carbon budget of a marsh is, you know, we used to think that it's really just what's being buried across the platform here. And can we come up with numbers for how rapidly it's burying? Is it keeping pace with sea level rise? But it's not just what's happening on the platform. It's what's happening here on the shoreline, as well as what's happening on this upland boundary. We need to take all of those factors into account when we're coming up with a budget. So we've put together a kind of conceptual model of the estuarine fringing salt marsh that includes both storage across the platform as well as export of carbon from the shoreline. Now, I'm going to go through basically how we would parameterize these carbon storage and carbon export terms. So carbon storage is a function of the accumulation rate. So that's how rapidly carbon is being buried in the marsh, and as well as the marsh area. It's scaled to the marsh area. And so you can change the marsh area by either eroding the shoreline or by migrating the marsh landward. So eroding the shoreline might serve to decrease the marsh area, but then transgressing landward might serve to increase the marsh area. And so that's going to change how much carbon is being stored across the platform. The carbon export term is a function of the rate of shoreline retreat and then how much carbon is in that piece of marsh that's eroded away. And so then if we're coming up with an annual carbon budget, all you need to do is basically difference the amount of carbon stored across the platform and how much is being exported. And we can basically model annually how much carbon is being imported to the marsh and how much is being exported out into the estuary. And we can determine whether or not the marsh is functioning as a sink or a source. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really important if we're a coastal manager and we're interested in basically getting a carbon credit for how much salt marsh we have. Because if we're functioning as a carbon source to the estuary, then we really can't get credit for our marsh being a carbon sequestration site because we're not offsetting any of those emissions. So now I want to go through a little bit more conceptually about what this net carbon budget is and how that might change through time. This is going to set up some of the numerical model simulations that we put together as part of our work. And so this figure is showing you an aerial photograph of the salt marsh. This red line is actually the shoreline at the first time step, so back in the 1950s. And then this graph is showing you the carbon budget through time. And I don't have numbers on here yet, so this is just conceptual. But on the x-axis, you can see high width to low width. So if this marsh, we're assuming that this marsh can't transgress landward, so if it's eroding, it's just narrowing. So you can think of going from high width to low width as going through time. And then the net carbon budget. So above this red line, there's more carbon being buried than is being exported. So it's a net import. There's a net import of carbon. This is a carbon sink. And below that line, it's a net export. It's a carbon source. And so what I'm going to show you, I'm going to split through these aerial photographs, and I'm going to hold that first shoreline constant, and you'll see the marsh changing and narrowing through time via shoreline erosion. And then you see we cross that point where we go from being a sink to a source. So there's more carbon that's being exported into the estuary than is being buried across the salt marsh. And that's a function of that area being reduced through time. So there's just not enough carbon storage to balance how much is being exported. We've gone from a sink to a source. And that continues through time. This area, we don't go back. We continue to function as a source. So that was our conceptual idea. And we wanted to go out and actually test that. We wanted to develop a carbon budget for a salt marsh and look at whether marshes that are fringing estuaries may be functioning as sinks or sources. So we went out to Carrot Island, North Carolina. This is a very similar area to what Dr. Fodry and Dr. Curran talked about in their presentations in previous weeks. We're here in eastern North Carolina along the eastern seaboard. Carrot Island is actually part of the Rachel Carson National Estuarine Research Reserve. It's near Beaufort, and it's also near Cape Lookout here. And this is a really great site to ask this kind of question because it's a marsh island that's eroding and it actually can't transgress the upland through time. We have these really deep dredge spoil, really high dredge spoil mounds that are the product of dredging out Taylor's Creek, and they deposit the sand here, and so the marsh can't transgress landward, but it's eroding, and so it's narrowing through time. So this provides us an opportunity to look at what happens to the carbon budget when we narrow through time. And this is an analog for a lot of marshes that are situated right in front of human development. So we've built a lot of development along our estuarine shorelines, and so that's going to be a real problem moving forward as the marshes can't migrate landward, but they're still eroding on the shoreline. So this is a Spartina alterniflora salt marsh. There are a couple of different transect sites that we occupied. A ramp site that has this type of shoreline morphology. It's kind of a beach-like feature. And then we have the scarp site, which is more of a cliff-like feature. And we collected cores across this to understand the underlying geology of the marsh, to understand the carbon that's being buried in this marsh, maybe how old the salt marsh is, basically to get a sense for the geology of the area and to parameterize our model. So I'm going to show you this video here of how we collect vibrocores. So this is a vibrating mechanism that's connected to a motor here. We connect it to this aluminum pole, and it actually just pounds this core into the earth. And it goes really easily through the salt marsh, and then once we hit sand or something more resistant, we have to put a little more pressure into it, maybe stand on it like Dr. Rodriguez is doing. And then it's really far in the earth, so we have to use a winch to pull it out. And once we've pulled this out of the earth, we can go and take it back to the laboratory and start to analyze it and come up with an understanding of what the marsh, what lies beneath the marsh. So these are what we call geologic cross-sections, and that's actually what we produce when we collect these series of vibrocores. So just to orient you with these, this top one is the ramp site, so that kind of beach-like shape, and then the bottom one is the scarp site, so that cliff site. We collected vibrocores going from 0 distance, which is right near those dredge spoil mounds. This is the most landward, and then as you go right towards the 250 meter and 160 meter distance, that's out into the estuary, and the estuary near this site is Oak Sound. And so each core, this black line at the top, that's the modern marsh surface. That's what we were walking on and what we drilled through. And so you can see in these cores that we actually drilled through the marsh, and then we encountered some other geologic units. So we hit a sand flat, which is kind of akin to a sandbar. It's a very thick, sandy unit. And then below that, we hit a lagoonal unit, so a kind of an estuarine clay, a very old unit. It's about 1,000 years old. And so you see that there's different units here. We know how thick the marsh is. I also want to point your attention to these shorelines that I've put on here. So this is the 1958 shoreline, the 1971 shoreline, and we got that from aerial photographs. And so basically, and we drilled cores through here, and it's just sand. So what we're seeing here is that we know the marsh was out this far, and it's eroded away, and all of that marsh is gone now. So that's going to be really important when we start to assess the carbon budget. We know that when the shoreline's eroding, all of that marsh, thus all of that carbon is being eroded away. So a very similar story here at the scarp site. We know that the marsh is pretty uniformly thick, it's above a sand flat and a lagoonal unit. Now we can take these cores and start to parameterize that model that we talked about earlier. So to determine the carbon accumulation rate through time, we took the cores, we sampled the marsh unit by slicing out 5-centimeter chunks. We dried that, we ground it up, and we actually sent it to a lab here at IMS for percent organic carbon analysis. We can determine how much carbon is in each of those units. We can then translate that into the grams of carbon that's in that package. We can sum that to develop an inventory so we know how much carbon is in the salt marsh. And then we can get the age of the marsh, and we do this by sampling out a blade of grass from the base of the marsh, and we assume that that blade of grass was deposited very close to when the marsh formed. We look for something that's intact, so a blade of grass. We can also use a seed, something that looks like it hasn't been reworked. And so we send that sample out for radiocarbon dating, so we actually date the carbon isotopes in that grass, and we can determine an age. And so now if we have the marsh age and we know how much carbon is in that marsh, we can develop the inventory, or we can develop the accumulation rate. It's basically how much carbon's there and how long it took to get there. Now to get the shoreline retreat rate, which is important for both determining how much carbon's being exported, but also how the area is changing through time and how carbon's being stored, how carbon storage may scale to that. We use aerial photographs from about 1958 to 2012, and you can see those shorelines here. That shoreline is eroding through time, and at the ramp site, so over here, that's eroding about 65 centimeters a year, and the scarp site is eroding a little more rapidly at about 76 centimeters a year. So now we can put all these pieces together and start to model that carbon budget through time. And so here's some of that model output. So we're looking at the ramp site first. On the x-axis here we have marsh width. And remember I was saying that site's narrowing through time. So you can also think of this width as time. So as the marsh is narrowing, we're going forward in time. On the y-axis here, there's net import and export of marsh carbon. So above this dashed line, there's a net import of carbon. This is a carbon sink. Below that, there's a net export. It's a carbon source. And so what we find when we parameterize this model and run the model, we actually, at that site, are still functioning as a carbon sink. But we're really close to transitioning. We predict that it would transition in the year 2021. Now at the scarp site, remember that's the site that's eroding a little more rapidly, we've actually made that transition. We're now functioning as a carbon source, and that happened in the year 1930. So going back to that idea of using marshes as these blue carbon sequestration sites, or this ability to offset carbon emissions because of the salt marsh carbon burial, we have to sustain that sequestration through time. And one of the ways to do that is to actually increase the carbon burial rate. So we're looking at data, similar figure to before, so carbon sink, carbon source, import and export of carbon. This is for the ramp site. So remember, if we changed nothing, this site would transition in the year 2021. So if we increase the carbon burial rate, which would actually be possible if we increase the rate of sea level rise. So remember I said marshes are tied to sea level rise. So any increase in the rate of sea level rise is going to result in the concomitant increase in the rate of carbon burial. So if we double the rate of sea level rise, maybe we double the rate of carbon burial, that's what this line is showing you, that we actually deflect that transition out to the year 2100. Now, another way that we could reduce or sustain the marsh as a carbon sink would be to lower the erosion rate. So maybe we've built some sort of shore protective structure, we've slowed the erosion down, we actually are able to continue that as a carbon sink even further into the future. So now, at about 2200 years, it will make that transition from sink to source. And that's only for halving the erosion rate. We haven't completely lost erosion. And the reason for that is because we're not only slowing down the amount of carbon that's being exported from erosion, but we're also slowing the loss of marsh area. So we're sustaining the area that we need for carbon storage. So one of these shore protective structures that we could actually use to reduce shoreline retreat is to construct oyster reefs along the shoreline. And Justin's going to talk all about oyster reefs and how they might protect marshes.
All right, let's take a break from talking about marshes for a moment. Let's focus on oysters. Here you see is a picture of an oyster reef. Oysters are a bivalve that they're broadcast spawners, so they have larvae that are planktonic, and they swim around our estuaries looking for a place to settle, and they tend to settle on hard substrate, and some of the only hard substrate in our estuaries happens to be other oysters. So growing on the backs of other oysters, these guys form these really consolidated reefs. Now, this is a picture of an intertidal reef, so you can see it's exposed. Oysters have this really great ability that while they prefer being underwater, they can spend a certain amount of time during a tidal cycle out of the water and exposed to the air. So they kind of they can range from subtidal to intertidal growth. But we've noticed in our estuaries that here in the lower parts of our estuaries where it's saltier, more like ocean water, these oysters don't grow so well when they're submerged all day. Now, previously, it's been thought that oysters can grow approximately at the rate of sea level rise. So, not even like less than a centimeter in a year. But on some constructed reefs that we've been studying, here's an example of a cluster of oysters that in the course of 3 years have grown 33 centimeters. So that's 11 centimeters a year, well over any previously recorded rates of growth. So these guys have a profound ability to grow and well above the rates of sea level rise. But it's kind of unclear as to where these guys, I talked about how they don't grow in deeper water, like how well these will grow in various areas of our estuaries. And that's what we want to focus on. Now with oysters, Ethan already talked about a lot of the ecosystem services of marshes. I just want to reiterate why oysters are also important. They provide a lot of those same ecosystem services. They're important habitat, both foraging and nursery habitat for fish species. They're great at filtering water, and they are the natural hardening to a lot of our shorelines, so they are shoreline protection. Unlike marshes, which have a great ability to sequester carbon, oysters aren't really known for that. But the fact that they can shelter shorelines, maybe mitigate shoreline erosion, and preserve marshes is a big benefit to carbon storage on our coasts. Now, I said we really need to figure out how these reefs are growing in order to basically effectively, in any circumstance, figure out where, if we're going to restore a reef, construct a reef along a living shoreline. Carolyn Curran's talked a lot about living shorelines. We need to know and understand how they're going to grow. We conducted a study here in North Carolina. We're here in the central coast of North Carolina and Back Sound in Middlemarsh. I just want to point out that what Ethan was talking about, Carrot Island, is right here really close to Middlemarsh. Middlemarsh is this really expansive network of salt marshes, seagrass beds, sandflats, and within that matrix there are a bunch of different oyster reefs. And we actually have the benefit that in 1997 and 2000 there were oyster reef construction projects where they constructed a bunch of different reefs of the same size in different areas of Middlemarsh. And what you see down here in the corner is the footprint of one of those old reefs. And these reefs have all grown out horizontally. You can see they've expanded, and up vertically. And for us to study how these reefs have grown, we used a terrestrial laser scanner. That's what this is showing. And what this laser scanner does is we set it up along these reefs, and we can actually image these reefs using the laser scanner. What it does is it creates these point clouds of millions of points. and allows us to actually visualize these reefs in three-dimensional space and create models that will allow us to compare reefs across different time steps. So in our instance, we're able to take a 2-year time step and measure the reef at both times, and then measure how much it's grown in different areas of the reef. Here's one of those digital elevation models. This is a reef in 2010, and you can see what we were looking at is the elevation in meters, and then in 2012. And you can see that the reef has grown aerially, so it's horizontally, it's grown out. And what we do is we take these two digital elevation models and we subtract them out from each other. And what we get is a subtraction map, where we can actually see the vertical change on different areas of the reef. And here you can see that this reef exhibits this halo of blue, and blue is positive vertical change, so that's areas of growth, whereas red is areas of loss. You see these dense patches of red on top of the reef. Well, that's probably from disturbances from boat impacts on the tops of these reefs. Here's another example looking at a reef we scanned at 10 years of its age and then at 12 years of its age. And again, just looking at the elevation here, this color scale, you can see how much more red and orange are on the reef at 12 years. And when you look at the subtraction map, you see how much blue is across this reef. It's really grown very well. Then you also notice that in the center, there's this kind of white area. And what that represents is this area of no growth. It's actually a plateau on top of the reef, where these reefs reach a certain point, which is right around mean sea level. And that seems to be a point where they can't grow beyond that, and they kind of become static. Another interesting thing to point out is you see this nice red line across this reef. You can actually see that in the picture here where a boat has run across this reef and left a nice ditch in it. So for us to analyze how well these reefs are growing, I had to break down the growth of these reefs and compare that to how much each particular elevation was exposed to air during the time frame of the study. And to do that, I essentially had to break down the elevations and determine how much time each of those elevations spent out of the water over the course of the study. And then I was able to refer that back to growth of the reef at any particular tidal exposure. And what that looks like is a figure like this. And what we're looking at here is an oyster growth model, where on the x-axis you're looking at oyster reef growth, and then on the y-axis you're looking at aerial exposure. Now this is the percent of time that any particular elevation is exposed to the air. And so here's on the left is kind of like a visualization for you to look at. Mean sea level is right around 50% aerial exposure, that makes sense. Mean low water falls at around 10% aerial exposure. And what we see with this growth curve is that the peak in the oyster reef growth occurs between 20 and 40% aerial exposure. So areas of the reef that were exposed from 20 to 40% of the time of an average daily tidal cycle exhibit the most growth. Then that growth actually tapers down to 0 at around 55%, which represents that growth ceiling, and that's that area where I talked about the plateaus forming. That's where the physical stress keeps them from growing beyond that. Then deeper in the water column, we get down to 10% mean low water. That growth curve again returns to 0. And this is where I was talking about we're not seeing much growth in subtidal environments in our lower estuaries. That this kind of confirms that growth below in areas that are exposed less than 10% of the time, oysters are not growing. Now we want to understand the processes that are involved and why. I just want to kind of give you an idea of why we see the trends we see. As I talked about, the growth ceiling, that plateau that forms is kind of determined by the physical stress of oysters being exposed to the air for too long, and that's a desiccation stress and heat stress. Then in the lower water column, down at mean low water, these are areas that are submerged more often, and what that does is allows more time for predators to access the reef when they're not exposed to the air, and also competitors like barnacles or other invertebrates that settle that can't persist in areas that are exposed for longer than what oysters can handle, and they thrive down here in the lower intertidal and subtidal areas, and they compete for resources that oysters need, so that's also adding to the problem. There's also an issue deeper in the water where sedimentation is a problem, where these sand flats are moving, and therefore it's easier for oysters at that depth to get covered up and no longer able to feed. Now, with sea level rise changing our coasts, we're going to see this pattern shift in the real space as that water climbs. So essentially, substrates that were once exposed at 30% are going to be exposed only 20%. So as sea level changes where those substrates fall, we're going to see problems down on the lower end where this growth rate, oyster reef growth rate, is in equilibrium with that rate of sea level rise. And so substrates that fall below these critical boundaries are becoming unsuitable for oyster reef growth. And so we have to really consider these factors when we're going to plan an oyster restoration project, like constructing a living shoreline. All right, speaking of living shorelines, let's start talking about actually fringing reefs. A lot of that previous work was done on isolated patch reefs. And I've taken that further, kind of looking at reefs that actually fall along saltmarsh shorelines. Here we have a low relief oyster reef along a marsh shoreline. They also form these spit-like structures, these groins or peninsulas that form along the marsh. And what I wanted to know was, how are these reefs, as they've evolved over time with the marsh shoreline, how have they impacted the marsh, and particularly with Ethan's work in mind, how they've impacted the carbon in the marsh. In order to do this, I did a similar thing that Ethan did and took core transects running from the marsh across the reef. And instead of using a vibrocore like he did, I used a jackhammer to push these cores down through the reef, as you can see in the movie, hopefully. Then these cores were taken back to the lab and processed in a similar fashion to what, as Ethan described, and I ran carbon analysis on these cores. Here's a sequence of cores looking at one of these transects as you move from the marsh across the reef. You can see here in the marsh core, the grass that's entrained in the sediment. Then as you move across the reef, you can see the live oysters at the top, then the buried shell material as you move down the core, and then underneath the reef, you'll notice that there are grass blades from old marsh that's been preserved under the reef. So this is indicating that these reefs are in a state of transgression, or they're moving up the marsh shoreline as the marsh retreats, actually. So these reefs are just overtaking old marsh shoreline as they grow. Here's a cross-section from one of these reefs. This is what I've deemed an undeveloped reef. It's a lower relief reef. I talked about how the reefs form these plateaus right around mean sea level. So you can see this reef elevation is listed on the y-axis over here. This reef is well below mean sea level. It still hasn't reached its peak in terms of where it can grow. So it's still developing. And this reef, when we look at the sediments underneath it versus sediments in the marsh interior, and we compare how much carbon was preserved in those sediments versus the marsh interior, we see that this reef has actually captured about 20% of the carbon that would have been in those marsh sediments prior to their loss. So it started actually to preserve marsh sediments. It's capping those sediments from being removed from the shoreline. When we look at a more mature reef, you can see this reef has reached the plateau where it's grown up to mean sea level. It's a more extensive reef. When we look at the sediments underneath this reef versus the sediments in the interior of the marsh, it's actually preserved about 55%. So it's done a much better job of preserving those sediments than the undeveloped reef. And actually, if you see how this reef has grown and it's starting to form up along the marsh edge right here at mean sea level, it's potentially actually preserving more, 90% or more of the sediments over here on this side of the reef as it's grown into this position. And I want to point out that these red 1950s, these are from radiocarbon dates taken both at the bottom of this reef and in the marsh that show that this process has largely happened within the last century. So these reefs, the fact that these reefs are growing up over the marsh shoreline has really occurred within the last 100 years primarily. Now, moving forward from this, it kind of seems that it would follow that what I'm seeing is that as, this is kind of backwards, but like we're looking down at the bottom, back in time, moving forward, that as these reefs develop, they become better and better at preserving marsh sediments and actually potentially completely shutting off marsh erosion as they reach this mature state. And this is going to be very important when you think about the timing of living shorelines and when you can expect a restoration project to fully benefit carbon storage in adjacent marshes. Now, tying this back to what Ethan presented, when we're looking at how marshes act as carbon sinks or carbon sources in a frame of time, if we consider that, as he said, that reducing the erosion rate by half will increase the time that a marsh acts as a carbon sink by at least 100 or 200 years in the instance of Carrot Island. If you install an oyster reef as a living shoreline, or as an oyster sill, you may in fact see this fully stabilized to where it never becomes a carbon source and it cuts off that erosion in asymptotes here. So, yeah, that's the big gist of what we've been working on, and just want to thank you guys for coming and listening to us, or logging in and listening to us, and we can take any questions you have.
Okay, well, thank you, Ethan and Justin. That was great. Yeah, now is your time for anyone who's on the call to type in your questions. Remember, this is your chance to hear it from the experts, so go ahead and, like I said, use the chat box and type in your questions, and then I will read them out loud.
I know everybody must be furiously typing right now.
Yeah. Well, we got our first question. They said, thank you for the great presentation. And then, where worldwide are we seeing the greatest loss of salt marshes?
So that's actually a question that we don't know entirely the answer to as a scientific community. we're seeing a lot of marsh shoreline erosion in heavily developed places. And that could be a function of boat wakes. We see, a lot of marsh that's being reclaimed for agricultural purposes, or maybe even development. We fill in marshes to build houses. Now, the question of the shoreline erosion, that is also a natural process, and we could be losing marsh shorelines just from, constant beating from wind waves, or maybe even storms, if those storms kind of occur at the right portion of the tidal cycle, maybe. And we don't really know the answer to that. That's one of the places that there's a lot of research that needs to be done where, why we're seeing the shoreline erosion that we do. And then also it's another interesting question of where in an estuary do you see certain, you might in the same, so use our case example of Bogue Sound. There are places in Bogue Sound that are eroding very rapidly, places like Carrot Island where we're eroding almost a meter a year. And then there are also places that are expanding into the estuary. So it's a very case-by-case example, but it's definitely exacerbated by human activities and maybe even sea level rise and, climate change if we have more intense storms.
Yeah, it's a very good question, but also kind of loaded.
Yeah, we don't, it's something that we need to learn more about because we're learning about like these things like they might be really important sources of carbon to the estuary. We're starting to learn that we may not know as much about marsh shorelines as we thought we did. Good question.
The next question came in, and they were asking, what was the mechanism, other than accumulation of sediment, by which the marsh plants store carbon? Is it in the dead, decomposing material from the marsh plants?
Yes. So it's in the dead, decomposing material, but it's also in the roots. And so when, if you kind of look under the marsh, you'll see the roots actually expand pretty far into the marsh subsurface. And so the marsh roots provide a lot of carbon to that sediment. And that's another way, and I didn't mention this, that they can actually grow upward. They can kind of expand their root system and increase their subsurface mass, I guess. And so, yeah, so it's the dead and decaying plant material. It's also root material and subsurface expansion. And then also trapping material from the water column.
Any other questions? Feel free to type them in. Well, I guess I will ask, Ethan, since you said you're a program alumni, if you could maybe just give a little bit of information on sort of how you got to where you are. Maybe just so coaches could go back and maybe explain, like, what got you interested in this topic and how did you get there?
Yeah, so I actually went to the Chesapeake Bay Marine and Environmental Science Governor's School in Virginia. And so I got really interested in environmental science and marine science there. So I think that probably piqued my interest, but I wish I could tell you that I knew right then that I wanted to be a marine scientist and a coastal geologist, but of course I went the route of maybe thinking I was going to be a medical doctor, maybe a lawyer, all these different things as I went through my first couple of years of college, and then took a geology class and absolutely loved it. And I actually was a marine geology class, and I said, yeah, this is what, I really want to do, and that kind of tied back into what I had learned in high school at the Marine Science School. Then it was, from there, it was continuing on to graduate school and continuing as a marine scientist. So, and when I was at the Chesapeake Bay Governor's School, we participated in the Blue Crab Bowl for 2 years, and that was a really fond memory I have of being with a community of people that enjoyed learning about marine science too. Not super common, I guess, when you're a 17-year-old, but yeah.
Okay, somebody asked, they wanted to know what other technologies you're using for your research.
So I guess I'll start and then Justin chime in because he's on the precipice of using some really cool technology. We use a lot of what's called geophysical techniques. So in addition to coring, that's one way that you could look below the Earth's surface. We can actually use sound waves to look below the surface. So we use seismic devices that actually send a sound wave out from an instrument down into the Earth, and we can basically see an image of below the Earth, either below the Earth or below the seafloor, and we can map different geologic units that way. We also use sonar to look at what's on the seafloor, and then we use the laser scanner. We also just do a lot of coring. It's not really technology, but it's the old-fashioned method. But Justin, you want to chime in?
Yeah, I guess while we haven't fully started incorporating this, we're moving towards kind of building off of our laser scanning, trying to see what we can do with different types of drone technology. And drones now are equipped with a lot of different tools to measure change like we might see on our shorelines, and that's what we're hoping to do. You start using some different ways of measuring a lot bigger areas faster.
Yeah, and it's also worth mentioning one of the tools that we use all the time is a GPS. So very high precision GPS, but it is extremely important to know where we are in space and where we are in elevation. So that's pretty much any field excursion that we go on, we take a GPS with us.
Okay. Any other questions? They said the oyster growth rate is huge. We did not understand growth prior to these, or did we not understand growth prior to these measurements, or is this growth rate special?
Well, I wouldn't say, okay. Prior to this study, there was no robust method at which we measured oyster reef growth. Prior methods had been basically coring and using radiocarbon dates to assess basically do an accumulation rate like what Ethan was talking about with the marsh, and assess how the rate at which they've been growing. And that's what really tied previous growth rates to the rate of sea level. I talked about them forming those plateaus. Well, that's kind of the same principle, is that they're going to grow with the rate of sea level. And we hadn't really measured how these reefs grow in a way that we did. And so I wouldn't say it's special. I would say that it just kind of changed the way that we were able to look at oyster reef growth.
Okay, any last questions? I've had a few people write in thank you for your presentation.
Oh, well,
you're welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll end our webinar for the day. Like I said, just to remind you, this is up on YouTube as of tomorrow, and so you can watch it, and please share it with either your students or other educators. And I just want to mention, so Ethan and Justin have talked about the researchers that they work with at IMS. Joel Fodry and Tony Rodriguez are actually going to be helping us tomorrow night. We're going to have a Google Hangout for the NOSB students tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern. And Joel and Tony are all going to be joined by a Duke scientist as well, and they're going to be answering any of your students' last-minute questions related to the theme. So if they watched any of these other webinars and have questions, or the one scientist, Grant, is a social scientist, so if they have questions about social science or policy, he'll be there to answer questions. So again, that's going to be at 7 p.m. tomorrow night, and you can find the login information on our front page of the NOSB website. Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you Ethan and Justin for presenting. We'll be happy to be down there in a few months for the finals competition, and tomorrow I will also add Justin and Ethan's email addresses to our webinar series website. They've been gracious enough to say that if you have any questions, you can reach out to them. So if you do, make sure you check our website tomorrow. All right, well, thank you again, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Have a good afternoon.